Today it is the 23rd of October, and today we're going to be talking about the situation on the Kherson, Avdiivka, and Kupiansk sectors, starting off with the units that Ukraine has involved in these attacks across the Dnipro River. We already established the movement of the 35th and 36th Marine Brigades across from Velika Novosilka sector to the Kherson front. Now we also have confirmation that the 38th Brigade has been moved into this region. The only Marine Brigade left that we don't know the status of is the 37th Marine Brigade. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens with that unit. Now looking at the front line, Russian sources report that the Ukrainians have been able to keep hold of their two bridgeheads that they recently established across the Dnipro River. We're going to look at the location of these two bridgeheads. One is adjacent to the Antonovsky rail bridge located over here, and the other is within the village of Krinky. So something very interesting about the Rybar map depicting the situation from, I believe, yesterday is that the Ukrainians control the floodplains just to the north of Oleshki in that map. So basically all of these floodplains to the north of the Konka River are marked as blue on the Rybar map. But in reality, I believe that most of these floodplains, especially the ones that are closer to the Konka River, are a gray zone due to the fact that they are a relatively open area and the fact that it is difficult to dig in these areas. But it is true that the Ukrainians do have some permanent positions that they established in the summer of 2023 around the Antonovsky Bridge over here, where I have the smaller rectangle, and also around the village of Dachi. But moving a bit to the east, we'll see what's going on within the village of Krinky, where the Ukrainians do continue to hold on to the western part of the village, while the Russians do have positions in the eastern parts. The Russians have been actively counterattacking for the past few days, especially elements of the 26th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 78th Motor Rifle Division. But so far, the Ukrainians have been able to hold back and push back these attacks, and they've been able to maintain their presence within the village. And this indicates, after a couple of days, that the Ukrainians are actually able to send speedboats across the river and send perhaps ammo crates, send additional supplies, and also would indicate that the Ukrainians are able to move back their forces that have been killed or wounded and perhaps conduct some minor troop rotations. That's the way that the Ukrainians have been able to continue to fortify their positions over here. And the longer term goal would be for the Ukrainians to turn this into an area that can withstand larger counterattacks and could be used as a spearhead of additional Ukrainian attacks deeper into the Russian line within Kherson Oblast. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians continue to try to degrade the Russian logistics. So a lot of the time they are utilizing FPV drones in their efforts, targeting different Russian pieces of equipment that are making their way from the rear, for instance, from the city of Verdansk all the way to Oleshki. Oleshki is this very important Russian hub of defense in the region where a lot of units are stationed and a lot of equipment isn't dispersed onto other parts of the front line. So in this video, you could see that the Ocean 12 group, which is just this one Ukrainian drone group, it's able to hit a Russian van that was towing a mortar or artillery piece. And this is on the same highway that we previously saw the three damaged pieces of equipment that were abandoned on the highway from Verdansk to Oleshki. And something that is also very interesting to note is that the Ukrainians have moved in this unit over here, the Birds of Magyar Air Reconnaissance Group. This is one of Ukraine's oldest drone groups and one of its most experienced groups. It fought in Bakhmut, and they were really the pioneer of a lot of Ukraine's drone warfare that we've really come to be familiar with after all of these months of fighting. So they were around Bakhmut, they were around the Velika Novosilka sector, they fought in Avdiivka previously, and now they've been moved to the Kherson front, and they've already started to conduct operations on the Russian rear. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out in the future. But the Russians have not been quiet in the sector. Here's a video that's from a couple of days ago, but it does show strikes by the Russian side. They were dropping in this video a FAV 500 with UMPK guidance kits on the Ukrainian positions near the rail bridge. And what was reported on October 21st for that one specific day by Ukrainian sources is that the Russians launched at least 36 FAV 500s and 1,500 guided glide bombs, which does indicate that the Russian Air Force is active above both the northern and southern banks of the Dnieper River, because the Russian strikes were not just on the southern part of the Dnieper River to the south over here, where the Ukrainians are establishing their bridgeheads, but it was also active to the north. So you had Russian strikes all over these different Ukrainian-controlled settlements adjacent to the Dnieper River, where you have the troop concentrations that are being formed, and you have all the equipment that's being prepared to be sent across the river. You also have the movement of Ukrainian electronic warfare systems and their own artillery for counter battery fire that's being moved closer to the Dnieper River in order for the Ukrainians to attack deeper into the Russian lines. So that's why you have this Russian response. But the fact that the Russians are also attacking on the southern parts, or like the southern bank of the Dnieper River, does indicate to us that the Ukrainians do still have an active presence over there themselves. Now, moving on to the Avdiivka sector, we're going to start off with Pervomaiske. If you remember, we talked about how the Russians launched attacks from multiple different directions around 18th, 19th of October. That's when these attacks were launched, and they were repulsed by the Ukrainian 59th Motorized Brigade, which is the unit located over here. So following that repulsion of that attack, the same Ukrainian forces launched their own localized counterattack. In terms of the ground gained, based on the changes that occurred around October 20th, it really amounted to less than a kilometer, perhaps 800, 700 meters of an advance through some of the most war-torn parts of Pervomaiske, through some of these blocks that have been totally decimated by the fighting in this region. But it does mean that the Ukrainians were able to slowly improve their positions. And the reason why the Ukrainians are holding on to Pervomaiske and are trying to fight hard for these forward positions is because the Ukrainians want to prevent the Russians from launching further advances along the E50 highway, this highway over here in the direction of Nitalove. This is a very important local command hub and also supply hub that branches out into other parts of the front line. So the Ukrainians want to prevent a Russian advance in that direction. Additionally, by having forward positions in Pervomaiske, the Ukrainians do have some firing positions that are able to hit Russian vehicles, columns, any sort of equipment that is making its way from Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, located over here, and then makes its way from all the way to the north through some of these roads that start off in Pisky and then go to Vodiane or to Opitny. And so by having the Ukrainian forces stationed in Pervomaiske, they're able to, for instance, use mortars to fire onto the Russian forces that are congregating in the area around Vodiane and around Opitny from the western flank to degrade the Russian forces before they even launch their attacks on Avdiivka's southern flank, which is located over here. So just as an example, here you have the Russians using their artillery to target a Ukrainian mortar that was spotted in the northern part of Pervomaiske. So this is most likely stationed over here, and you can see how it was concealed, most likely stationed over here in order to fire onto the advancing Russian forces to the northeast and prevent a further attack onto Avdiivka's southern flank. So I'll just quickly let you guys see the destruction caused by the artillery strike, which is located over here, although it is hard to see. Now, in addition to mortars, the Ukrainians are also using artillery and FPV drones to target the Russian columns that are advancing from Pisky into Vodiane to congregate and then launch attacks further north. So here's just one example of the aftermath of one Russian armored fighting vehicle along this road from Pisky to Vodiane that was set on fire due to the Ukrainian response. Additionally, we have this video over here showing a column of Russian trucks that were moving along a road that starts in Donetsk and then goes through Pisky. Again, the Pisky is very important on a local level because from there's two different routes that branch out towards the front line. So you can see here many different Russian trucks that move very close to the front line near the line of contact around Pervomaiske, most likely to drop off infantry. And the area where they get dropped off, as you can see on the geolocated marker, is around this area over here. This entire ring road, as it's called, the Donetsk ring road, and then from there those Russian forces are sent to fight within the village of Pervomaiske itself. Now, as for the Terrakon slag keep, there is still no visual confirmation of the Russian capture of the slag keep, despite reports from the Russian side over the past few days of the capture of this important local heights. But Ukrainian sources, they allege that they still have control over the slag keep, but that there are heavy battles going on in its surroundings. Now, looking at the Kupiansk front, the Russians have launched attacks in the direction of Ivanivka from Yahidne. So I'll show the arrows on the map. There's also attacks towards nearby towns just to the north of Kislivka, for instance, and to the south of Pershotravneve. And if we zoom out, we'll understand why the Russians want to attack over here. The Ukrainians, they have this cluster of 4 different villages that I'm going to mark within this blue rectangle. And this serves as a vanguard by the Ukrainian forces, where they do have a large amount of troops and they do have a lot of prepared defenses that they've built up over many, many months in this region, because the front has been very stagnant over here. And so they've had time to dig in and prepare defenses against a Russian attack. And the reason why they're defending in this region is because the Russians, their goal would be to knock out the Ukrainian forces from these 4 villages and try to advance along this specific highway and through the different open fields in the region in order to reach the eastern outskirts of Kupiansk and flank it, not just from the north like they're trying to do around Sienkiivka, located over here, but also from the east, which would be more difficult to defend against. But because of the fierce Ukrainian resistance within the cluster of 4 villages, the Russians have been unable to do this yet. And that's why the Russians are launching a head-on assault into the village of Ivanivka. So we're going to zoom in now and look at some footage that was released from the Kraken special units. This is one of Ukraine's more experienced units. They've had a lot of fighting, especially on the Kupiansk front. And so they released a YouTube video, and just remember that whenever basically any unit on any side is releasing a large compilation of war footage, of course they're just going to show what's favorable to their own side. But that applies to everyone. But I just want everyone to keep that in mind when I'm showing this. If there was Russian footage showing the same encounter, then I would have shown it, but there just isn't any. But without further ado, let's get into what actually happened. So in the beginning of the video, the Kraken unit, they show the Ukrainian forces engaging in firefights in a forested area. This could really be anywhere on the Kupiansk sector. It could be around here because there are some forested areas, but there's also an extremely forested area around Liman Pershi and Sienkiivka, where we've seen a lot of footage come out of small arms fire engaging between both the Russian and Ukrainian side, and there are also a lot of dugouts in different fortified positions that were set up within these forests. So it's possible that the Kraken unit is also operating in this area. The geolocation for the beginning of the video is unknown. But then later on, the more interesting part is that the Kraken unit, they show the geolocated advance of a Russian column with at least 5 tanks, most likely from the 1st Tank Army, and several other vehicles from their starting point in Yahidne. So they advanced from multiple different positions in the actual attack. There were some attacks on Ivanivka's southern flank. There were attacks that were head-on. The main thrust was on this specific path over here, and there may have also been attacks further north. And if we go to the north, we'll see that there's also Russian positions around Orlyansk. And so there were most likely also attacks just to the west of this village. But the nexus of the Russian attacks were along this specific path over here. So they were able to advance with their tank column about 1 or 2 kilometers, 1.5 kilometers, we'll say, to this specific junction over here. This is a junction of multiple different paths that collide just to the northeast of Ivanivka, and this is where you had some of Russia's infantry dismount at this specific tree line. Now, I can't show what happened next for obvious reasons, but the link is over here. What you'll see is that the Ukrainian artillery was able to take out some of the Russian forces that were congregating in this specific part of the tree line once they dismounted, perhaps from BMPs, or maybe because some of these videos actually showed Russian forces standing on top of tanks, so they may have gotten off of them over there. But anyhow, there were Ukrainian artillery strikes in response that did lead to some killed and some wounded that landed over here. Then the Kraken unit released a compilation of footage from FPVs. And an important disclaimer is that we don't know when all these videos were recorded. So some of them may be recorded a long time ago. Some of them may be recent. But nonetheless, what it does show is that the FPVs were able to hit the Russian pieces of equipment. It is unknown whether all of them were destroyed. Some of them definitely were destroyed based off of footage after the fact shown by Kraken, but we can't say for sure with all of them. So in this compilation, you could see that the FPVs hit 9 T-72B3 tanks, 3 trucks, 3 BMPs, and 1 piece of self-propelled artillery. Now, once the Ukrainians were able to actually push back the initial Russian advance, they sent in at least one of their own T-80s, so at least one of them sent them from Ivanivka to the same open fields where the Russian columns advanced, and they actually were able to hit a Russian T-72B3. And in the video, you could see how at the end, the crew of the tank gets out. So we'll skip to the part with that incident occurring. So here you could actually see a massive strike onto the tank. And I know it's hard to see, but in this still, you could see that there are infantry that, or not infantry, sorry, but the crew of the tank that get out. And it seems like at least some of them were able to get out of it alive. And regardless, you had another T-80 tank, it might be the same one, but either way, it engages Russian positions around Yahidne. So this is a geolocation of the tank where it hit the target of the Russian forces. So there were Russian infantrymen all across this road over here. So they were targeted by the T-80 tank. And this is interesting because this specific road was probably like the beginning of the Russian advance, like the first route they took before they branched off into different assault vectors. So most likely you had columns and infantry that advanced along this road on the northern parts of Yahidne, and the ones that wanted to attack further north went like this, and then they advanced like that. The ones that wanted to go through the center with that main thrust occurred over here, and the ones that wanted to advance further south to the south of Ivanivka advanced in this direction. And in regards to the Russian garrison that was sent to attack in the direction of southern Ivanivka, during the night after the initial Russian attack, there was a Ukrainian response to the remnants of the Russian infantry that were still stationed in a tree line just to the south of Ivanivka. And here you could see video of 120 millimeter mortar fired by the Ukrainian side during the night on the Russian infantry within this specific tree line. And that one is located over here. But for now, there are still no major changes to the front line. We're going to have to wait and see if the Russians increase the scale of the attacks over here to the same extent as they did in Avdiivka, for instance, as we did see some armored assaults over here, including with many different tanks. We're going to have to wait and see if the 1st Tank Army continues to launch similar attacks in the near future. But at the same time, the Russians are also attacking to the south of Pershotravneve. I can't show this video, but what you'll see here, if you click on the link, is that there are a Russian group of forces that advance through this different specific path over here, through this field. They're crawling, so they don't want to get spotted by the Ukrainian side. What I think is happening on a more broad level is that the Russians do want to try to advance through the fields over here and get a foothold within this specific part of Ukraine's defense. The Ukrainians do have some defensive positions that are very strong in Petropavlivka, and you can see how Petropavlivka, it extends further east. Even when the houses are gone and you go further east, there's still tree lines in this region over here. So there definitely is a certain level of Ukrainian defense in this region. And this entire line over here that I'm marking in blue, that is a couple of kilometers to the south of the line of contact. There are ditches over there, so there are some natural barriers that could be used by the Ukrainian side to fortify and prevent the Russian advance. So the Russians do want to overrun those positions in order to get closer to the defenses in Petropavlivka, and also to try, at least in theory, to flank the troop cluster that we talked about earlier in the video within these 4 villages over here from the north. So in that video, the Ukrainians spot the Russian group advancing and they fire at them with cluster munitions. And as a result, there are some killed and wounded, and the attack dissipates like that. And so, yeah, that's all I have for frontline updates. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.